Keep the formula. The man's voice came from behind her, low and steady, cutting through the soft hum of the store like it didn't belong there. But Madeline Brooks didn't turn around. Not yet, because her fingers were still trembling as she tried to gather the last few coins scattered across the checkout counter, quarters and dimes clinking softly under the harsh fluorescent lights, each tiny sound echoing louder in her ears than it should have, like a countdown she couldn't stop, like proof that this was really happening, that she was really here, counting out her last $6.82 in loose change just to buy a single can of baby formula. And even as she pushed the coins toward the cashier with a quiet, "I'm sorry, I know it's a lot," she could already feel the weight of the people behind her, the impatient shifting, the barely concealed sighs, the kind that weren't loud enough to call out but loud enough to make sure she heard them anyway. And she kept her eyes down, because looking up would mean seeing their faces, and she didn't think she could handle that right now. Not when her chest already felt tight enough. Not when her mind kept replaying the same thought over and over again. What if it's not enough? What if I counted wrong? What if I have to put it back? And the thought alone made her grip tighten around the edge of the counter, as if letting go would somehow send everything crashing down with it. And the cashier, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes but a gentle voice, began counting the coins one by one, her fingers moving methodically, professionally. But even that small kindness only made the moment stretch longer, made the silence heavier, made every second feel like it was pressing down on Madeline's shoulders, and she swallowed hard, her throat dry, her lips parting just slightly, as if she might say something else, maybe apologize again, maybe explain, but the words wouldn't come. Because how do you explain that your 8-month-old daughter can't keep down the cheaper formula? That she cries for hours until her tiny face turns red and her body shakes? That the doctor had said this brand, this exact brand, was the only one that worked, and that it cost nearly twice as much, and that you had already watered down the last bottle more than you should have, and that tonight, this can right here was the difference between your baby sleeping peacefully or screaming through the night in pain. And none of that sounded like something you could say out loud to strangers standing behind you in line. Strangers who only saw a woman holding them up over a few dollars. Strangers who didn't know that she had skipped her own meals for 2 days just to stretch what little she had left, and so she stayed quiet, her eyes fixed on the growing stack of counted coins as the cashier paused, glanced up at the register, then back at the pile, and in that tiny hesitation, Madeline's heart dropped, because she knew, she just knew, before the words even came, and when the cashier finally spoke, softly, almost apologetically, "You're short $2.47. It felt like the ground tilted beneath her feet, like everything inside her just stopped, and for a second she didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even blink, because she had already counted them 3 times, she had already checked every pocket, every corner of her worn wallet, even the bottom of her bag, hoping to find a forgotten dollar, a stray bill, anything, but there was nothing left, nothing at all. And the realization settled in like a cold weight in her chest, pressing down harder with every passing second, and behind her, someone exhaled sharply, another voice muttered something under their breath, and Madeline felt the heat rise to her face, that familiar, burning shame creeping up her neck as she forced herself to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, I must have miscounted." And her hands moved automatically, reaching for the can of formula as if she had already accepted what came next, as if she had no other choice but to give it back, even though the thought of walking out without it made her stomach twist painfully, even though the image of her daughter's small, tired face flashed in her mind, and just as her fingers brushed the metal edge of the can, the voice behind her spoke again, closer this time, firmer, "Don't." And this time, she couldn't ignore it, because there was something in the tone, something that didn't match the impatience around them, something that felt different, and slowly, hesitantly, Madeline turned her head just enough to see the man standing behind her, tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked out of place in a convenience store like this, his expression unreadable but his gaze steady, not on her face, but on the can of formula sitting between them. And for a moment, everything seemed to quiet, the murmurs, the shifting, even her own racing thoughts, as if the world had narrowed down to just this moment, this stranger, and the simple, impossible tension hanging in the air between them. Madeline's breath caught as she met his gaze, and for a split second she did not know what to do, because nothing about this situation made sense, not the calm certainty in his voice, not the way he stood there as if the tension in the air did not touch him at all, and definitely not the fact that he had just told her not to put the formula back, as if it were that simple, as if the problem could just disappear because he said so. And her first instinct was to shake her head, to refuse, because that was safer, because accepting help from a stranger had never ended well in her experience. And yet her fingers did not move, still hovering over the can as the silence stretched again, thicker this time, heavier, until the cashier cleared her throat softly, unsure, glancing between them as if waiting for someone to decide what would happen next, and behind them, another impatient shuffle broke through, a man muttering something about being late, but the stranger did not look away, did not acknowledge anyone else, his attention fixed on the situation in front of him with a focus that felt almost deliberate. And then, without raising his voice, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a bill, and placed it on the counter beside the scattered coins, his movement smooth, controlled, like this was nothing to him, like it was just another transaction, and Madeline felt her chest tighten again, this time for a different reason, because now it was real, now the help was right there in front of her, undeniable. And that made it harder, not easier, because taking it would mean admitting she could not do this on her own, admitting that she had reached a point where even a few dollars stood between her and taking care of her child. And she shook her head quickly, almost instinctively, her voice coming out more strained than she intended as she said, "No, I cannot accept that." Her hand pulling back from the counter as if distance alone could undo what he had just done. But he did not move the bill, did not argue immediately. He just watched her for a moment. And there was something in his expression now, something sharper, more focused, as if he was studying her reaction rather than the situation itself. And then he asked, quietly, "How old is your baby?" And the question hit her off guard, enough to make her hesitate, because it was not what she expected, not a push, not a reassurance, but something else entirely, something that felt personal in a way she was not ready for, and she swallowed, her eyes flickering down to the counter again as she answered, almost automatically, 8 months, and the words felt heavier than they should have, like saying them out loud made everything more real, made the struggle more visible, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the noise of the store returning around them in fragments, the beep of another register, the faint hum of the refrigerators, but it all felt distant, muted, because Madeline could feel the shift, could sense that something in the moment had changed, even if she could not yet understand how. And then her phone rang, sharp and sudden, the sound cutting through everything, making her flinch as she fumbled to pull it from her pocket, her heart already racing before she even saw the name on the screen, because there were only a few reasons anyone would call her at this time of day, and none of them were good. And when she answered, her voice came out tight, barely controlled, "Hello," and the response on the other end was rushed, anxious, and the moment she heard the words fever and crying, the rest of the world seemed to fall away completely, her grip tightening around the phone as her stomach dropped, every instinct in her body screaming at her to move, to leave, to get to her daughter as fast as possible. And suddenly the formula, the coins, the people behind her, none of it mattered anymore, because there was only one thing that mattered now. And she turned back toward the counter, panic already rising in her chest as she tried to think, tried to calculate how long it would take to get home, how far it was, whether she could run it, whether there was a bus coming soon. But she already knew the answer. She already knew she did not have the time or the money for any of it. And for the first time since this started, real fear broke through the fragile control she had been holding on to, visible now in the way her voice shook as she said, almost to herself, "I need to go." And it was in that moment, as she stepped back from the counter, as everything threatened to unravel completely, that the man behind her moved again, his presence suddenly closer, more immediate, and before she could fully process it, his voice came once more, steady, decisive, "You are not walking." Madeline froze mid-step, her body already turning toward the exit, but her mind struggling to catch up with what he had just said, because there was something in his tone that did not sound like a suggestion, not even an offer. but something closer to a decision already made, and that alone made her hesitate, her grip tightening around her phone as the voice on the other end continued speaking, describing her daughter's condition in anxious fragments. Words like burning up and will not stop, crying slipping through and lodging deep in her chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think, and she closed her eyes for a brief second, trying to steady herself, trying to focus on what mattered, which was getting home as fast as possible, not this stranger, not this moment, not the strange tension that seemed to be building between them for reasons she could not understand. And when she opened her eyes again, she shook her head quickly, almost defensively, her voice tight as she said, "I can walk. It is only 15 blocks." Even though she knew as soon as the words left her mouth that it was not true in any way that mattered, not with the time it would take, not with the weight pressing down on her chest, not with the image of her baby alone and crying burning in her mind. And he did not argue immediately, which somehow made it worse, because instead of dismissing her or pushing harder, he simply stepped slightly closer, close enough that she could feel the shift in his presence, the quiet confidence that seemed to follow him. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more deliberate. "You will not make it in time." And the certainty in that statement cut through her denial with a precision that left her momentarily speechless, because he was right, and they both knew it. And that realization made something inside her falter, that fragile line she had been holding on to finally starting to crack, and she looked down again, her thoughts racing, calculating distances, time, options, but every path ended the same way, with her arriving too late, with her daughter still crying, still in pain, and the fear that had been building finally pushed past everything else, surfacing in the way her voice trembled as she said, "I do not have money for a cab." The admission slipping out before she could stop it, raw and unfiltered, and for a second she regretted it immediately, hated the way it sounded, hated how much it revealed, but he did not react the way she expected. There was no pity, no surprise, just a brief pause as if he had already anticipated that answer, and then he reached into his pocket again, not for money this time, but for something else, something that caught the light as he held it up between them, a set of car keys, sleek and unmistakably expensive, and he extended them toward her without hesitation, his gaze steady, unwavering. "Then you are coming with me." And the simplicity of it, the directness, left her staring at him in disbelief, because nothing about this was normal, nothing about this made sense, and yet the urgency of the situation pressed in from all sides, leaving her with no space to question it the way she normally would, no time to weigh the risks or the consequences, and she hesitated, just for a moment, her instincts pulling her in opposite directions, caution telling her to refuse, to step back, to walk away from a situation she could not control, while something else, something stronger, something driven by fear and desperation, pushed her forward, because this was not about her anymore. It was about her daughter, and that thought alone was enough to tip the balance, her hand moving slowly, almost uncertainly, as she reached for the keys, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest second, and even that small contact felt charged with something she could not quite place, something that made her pull back slightly as she took them, her voice quieter now, uncertain but resolute. "I will pay you back." The words automatic, almost reflexive, because it was the only way she could accept this, the only way she could justify it to herself. And he did not respond immediately, did not acknowledge the statement in the way she expected. Instead, his gaze shifted, briefly, to her face, then to something just beyond her, as if he was seeing more than what was right in front of him. And when he spoke again, it was softer, almost to himself, Madeline Brooks. And the sound of her name in his voice hit her like a sudden jolt, sharp and disorienting, because she had not told him that, had not introduced herself, had not given him anything that could explain how he knew it. And for a second the urgency, the panic, everything else seemed to pause as she stared at him, confusion and something close to alarm flickering across her face, her grip tightening around the keys as one question pushed through everything else, unspoken but unmistakable. "How do you know who I am?" And the answer, whatever it was, lingered just beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. Madeline's mind struggled to catch up with the sound of her own name coming from a stranger's lips, the syllables echoing louder than they should have, cutting through the urgency, the fear, everything else that had been driving her just seconds ago. And for a moment she did not move, did not speak, her eyes fixed on him as if waiting for an explanation that did not come, because he was already turning slightly, already shifting his attention toward the exit as though the next step was obvious, as though there was no need to explain anything at all, and that only made the confusion sharper, more unsettling, because nothing about this was obvious to her, not the way he had stepped in, not the way he spoke, and definitely not how he knew her name. And yet the shrill sound of her phone still pressed against her ear pulled her back, the voice on the other end repeating her daughter's name again, more urgently this time, reminding her that every second she stood here was a second she was not moving, not getting closer, not helping, and that thought alone forced her forward, her feet moving almost automatically as she followed him toward the door, her fingers tightening around the keys he had given her, the cold metal grounding her just enough to keep going. Even as questions crowded her mind, unanswered and growing louder with each step. And when the automatic doors slid open, the cool air outside hit her face, sharp and immediate, carrying with it the distant noise of traffic and the fading light of late afternoon, and she barely noticed any of it because he was already ahead of her, already walking toward a sleek black car parked near the curb, its polished surface reflecting the surroundings in a way that made it stand out even in a crowded lot. And for a brief second she hesitated again, her instincts catching up, reminding her that she was about to get into a car with someone she did not know, someone who knew her name without explanation, someone who had stepped into her life in the span of minutes and changed everything about this moment. And that hesitation showed, just slightly, in the way she slowed, her steps faltering as she reached the passenger side, her hand hovering near the door handle without pulling it open, and he noticed, of course he noticed, because nothing about his awareness seemed accidental, and he paused on the other side of the car, his gaze lifting to meet hers across the roof, steady, assessing, not impatient but not soft either. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured. "You do not have time to question this." And the words landed with a quiet weight, not dismissive, not harsh, just a simple statement that left no room for argument. And she swallowed, her throat tight, because he was right again. And that was what made this so difficult, because every instinct told her to be careful, to protect herself, but every second mattered more than her comfort right now, more than her questions, more than anything else. And so she forced herself to move, to open the door, to slide into the seat. The interior of the car warm and unfamiliar, carrying a faint scent of leather and something clean, expensive, a stark contrast to the worn fabric of her coat and the lingering smell of the convenience store. And she placed the keys in her lap for a moment before realizing they were not hers to keep, her fingers tightening briefly before she set them carefully in the center console, as if even that small act required thought. And then he was inside as well, the door closing with a soft, solid sound that seemed to seal the moment in place, and the engine started. Almost immediately, smooth and quiet. And as the car pulled away from the curb, she finally turned toward him again, unable to hold it back any longer. The question that had been building since he spoke her name breaking through, her voice low but firm despite the tension in it. "How do you know who I am?" And this time he did not avoid it, did not deflect or ignore it. Instead, his hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead for a second longer than necessary before he answered. And when he did, there was something different in his tone now, something heavier, something that carried a past she could not yet see. "Because you disappeared," he said quietly, and the words lingered between them, incomplete, loaded with meaning she could not fully grasp, her confusion deepening even as her heart pounded faster, because she had no memory of this man, no connection she could recall, no reason he should be speaking as if her life had intersected with his in a way that mattered. And yet the certainty in his voice made it impossible to dismiss. And before she could respond, before she could press further, his gaze flicked briefly toward her, sharp and searching, and then to the small bag on the floor at her feet, the can of formula barely visible inside. And something shifted again, something that made the next words come out slower, more deliberate, as if each one carried weight he had been holding back. "And now you have a baby," he added, and the implication hung there, unspoken but unmistakable, sending a ripple of unease through her chest, because whatever he thought he knew, whatever connection he believed existed, it was clearly tied to something she had not told him, something she had not told anyone. And as the car picked up speed, the distance between her and her daughter slowly closing, a new tension took its place beside the fear, quieter but just as pressing, because the question was no longer just how she would get home in time, but what exactly she had just stepped into, and who this man really was. Madeline's fingers tightened around the edge of her seat as his words settled in, the weight of them pressing into her chest in a way she could not ignore, because there was something about the way he said it, not questioning, not guessing, but knowing, as if her life had unfolded in front of him without her realizing it. And she shook her head slightly, more to herself than to him, trying to push back against that certainty, because it did not make sense. None of it did, and yet she could not deny the unease building inside her, the quiet sense that she was missing something important, something just out of reach. And for a moment she did not answer, her gaze dropping to her hands in her lap, to the faint scratches on her knuckles from work, to the way her fingers still trembled slightly from everything that had happened in the last few minutes. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than she felt, controlled in a way that came from necessity rather than calm. "I think you have me confused with someone else." And the words sounded reasonable, logical, the only explanation that made sense. But even as she said them, she could feel that he did not believe it, could sense it in the slight tightening of his jaw, in the way his grip on the steering wheel shifted just enough to betray a reaction he was otherwise holding back. And he did not respond immediately, which made the silence between them stretch again, thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the distant sounds of traffic passing by. And Madeline found herself watching him from the corner of her eye, trying to place him, trying to find some trace of familiarity in his features, in the sharp lines of his face, in the controlled way he carried himself. But there was nothing, no memory, no connection, just a growing tension that made her chest feel tighter with every passing second. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, almost as if he was choosing his words carefully. "I do not confuse people like that." And there was no arrogance in the statement, just a simple, unsettling confidence that made it harder to dismiss. And she looked away quickly, back toward the window, the city passing by in blurred shapes as they moved faster now, each block bringing her closer to home, closer to her daughter. And she clung to that thought, forcing herself to focus on it instead of the questions she could not answer, instead of the man beside her who seemed to know more than he should. And her phone buzzed again in her hand, the sound sharp enough to pull her attention back instantly. And she answered without hesitation, her voice softer now, urgent but controlled, asking for updates, listening as the person on the other end spoke, describing the fever again, the way her daughter would not settle, the way she kept reaching out as if looking for her. And that image alone made Madeline's throat tighten painfully, her eyes closing briefly as she pressed the phone closer, whispering reassurances she was not sure she believed herself. "I am on my way. I will be there soon." And when she hung up, the silence in the car felt heavier than before, filled with everything she had not said, everything he had implied. And she exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, trying to push through the fear that threatened to take over, because she could not afford to lose control now, not when she was so close. And after a moment, she spoke again, this time more directly, her voice carrying a quiet firmness despite the strain underneath it. "You still have not told me how you know my name." And this time she did not look away, her gaze fixed on him as if refusing to let the question pass unanswered again. And he seemed to consider it, his expression unreadable for a brief second before something shifted, something that looked almost like recognition mixed with something deeper, something unresolved. And when he finally answered, his voice carried a weight that made her heart skip. "You worked for me," he said, and the words landed harder than anything else he had said so far, because they opened a door she had not expected, one that led somewhere she had not allowed herself to look back toward in a long time. And for a second, she just stared at him, the pieces starting to move in her mind, slow and uncertain, because there had only been one place, one company, one chapter of her life that fit those words, a chapter she had walked away from without looking back, a chapter she had buried under everything that came after. And her voice came out softer now, almost hesitant despite herself. "That is not possible." But even as she said it, The certainty in her tone was gone, replaced by something else, something closer to doubt. Because the past she had tried so hard to leave behind suddenly did not feel as distant as it once had, and the man sitting beside her no longer felt like a stranger. Not entirely, not anymore. And the realization that she might be wrong, that he might not be mistaken at all, settled in slowly, bringing with it a new kind of tension, one that had nothing to do with money or strangers or convenience stores, but everything to do with a past she had not been ready to face. Madeline's breath slowed just slightly as his words echoed in her mind. You worked for me. The sentence repeating itself in a way that made it impossible to ignore, because now that he had said it, now that the idea had been placed in front of her, something faint began to stir beneath the surface of her memory, something incomplete, fragmented, like trying to recall a face from a photograph she had not seen in years. And she shook her head again, but this time, it was not as certain as before, not as firm, because doubt had already found its way in, quietly unraveling the confidence she had held just moments ago. And she glanced at him again, studying him more carefully now, not just as a stranger who had helped her, but as someone who might belong to a part of her life she had tried to leave behind. And there was something about the way he carried himself, the quiet authority, the controlled movements, the sense that he was always observing, always calculating, that felt familiar in a way she could not fully explain, and her chest tightened slightly as she tried to place it, tried to connect it to something real, something she could name. But before she could push further, her phone buzzed again, sharp and urgent, pulling her attention back instantly, and she answered quickly, her voice soft but strained as she listened, nodding slightly even though the person on the other end could not see her, her free hand gripping the edge of the seat. As she asked questions, trying to understand how bad it was, how high the fever had gotten, whether her daughter had eaten, whether she had stopped crying at all, and the answers came back in worried tones, uncertain, which only made the knot in her chest tighten further. And when the call ended, she exhaled slowly, her hand trembling slightly as she lowered the phone, her mind racing again, but this time not just with fear, but with something else, something heavier, because now there were two things pressing in on her at once. Her daughter waiting for her, and the man beside her who seemed to know more about her past than she was ready to face. And she closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady herself, trying to push the confusion aside long enough to focus. Because she needed clarity, she needed something solid to hold on to. And when she opened them again, her voice was quieter, but more direct, more intentional. Where did I work? And the question hung there between them, simple, but loaded. Because it was no longer a denial, no longer a rejection, but an acknowledgement that something might be there, something she had not fully remembered yet, and he did not answer immediately. His gaze fixed on the road as the car moved smoothly through traffic, the city lights beginning to flicker on as the evening settled in, and for a moment she wondered if he would avoid it again, if he would leave her with another half-answer, another piece of something she could not fully understand. But then he spoke, his voice steady, deliberate. Westridge Innovations, and the name hit her like a quiet shock, not loud, not sudden, but deep, because it unlocked something immediately, something clear and undeniable, a memory she could not push away, the office floors, the long hours, the sense of purpose she used to carry, the version of herself that had existed before everything changed, and her breath caught slightly as she turned her head toward him, her eyes widening just a fraction, because that was not a random guess. Not a coincidence. That was exact, precise, and it meant he was telling the truth, or at least part of it, and the realization settled in slowly, bringing with it a mix of disbelief and something closer to unease, because if he knew that, if he knew where she had worked, then the connection between them was real, even if she had not seen it yet, and her voice came out softer now, almost cautious, as if she was stepping into something uncertain. I left that job almost 2 years ago. And even as she said it, she could feel the weight of that decision again, the abruptness of it, the way she had walked away without explanation, without closure. And for the first time since this conversation began, something in his expression shifted in a way she could see clearly, a flicker of recognition mixed with something deeper, something that had been waiting beneath the surface. And when he responded, his voice carried a quiet intensity that made her chest tighten again. I know, he said. And the simplicity of that answer only made everything more complicated, because it meant he had noticed, he had remembered, he had not forgotten. The way she had disappeared, and that realization brought a new question to the surface, one she had not asked yet, one she had not even considered until now, because if he knew all of this, if he had been aware of her leaving, then there was only one explanation left, one that made her pulse quicken slightly as she turned toward him again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" And this time, she did not look away, because whatever answer came next, she knew it was going to change everything she thought she understood about this moment, about him, and about the past she had tried so hard to leave behind. The question lingered between them, quiet but heavy, and for the first time since she had gotten into the car, Daniel did not answer right away, his jaw tightening just slightly as his eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, the glow of streetlights reflecting faintly across the windshield, and Madeline felt the pause more than she heard it, felt the way it stretched, deliberate, controlled, as if he was deciding how much to say and how much to hold back, and that alone made her chest tighten. Again, because whatever the answer was, it was not simple, not casual, not something he could just say without thinking. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it now, something unmistakable. "Daniel Hayes," he said, and the name landed with a quiet finality, as if it should mean something, as if it should connect instantly. But for a second it did not fully, not until her mind caught up, not until the pieces began to shift into place, slow at first, then all at once, and her breath caught as recognition hit, not from a personal memory, not from a conversation or a moment shared, but from something else entirely, something distant yet familiar, the company website, the annual reports, the occasional glimpses of leadership profiles she had once skimmed through during late nights at the office. And suddenly the authority in his presence made sense, the confidence, the way he had taken control without hesitation, because this was not just someone who worked there, not just someone who knew the company. This was the person at the top, the one whose name carried weight even in rooms she had never been in, and her fingers curled slightly against her palm as the realization settled in, her voice quieter now, almost uncertain despite everything she had already faced tonight. "You are the CEO." And it was not really a question, more like a confirmation she needed to hear out loud, and he nodded once, briefly, without looking at her, as if that part of it did not matter, as if the title itself was not the point, and that only made the situation feel more unreal, more disorienting, because the distance between who she was now and who she had been back then suddenly felt smaller, compressed into this moment in a way she was not prepared for, and her mind raced, trying to reconcile the past with the present, trying to understand how she had gone from being one of hundreds of employees in a building to sitting here, in a car with him, being driven home by the man who had once been several levels above her in a world she had quietly walked away from. And the question that followed came out before she could stop it, sharper this time, edged with something she could not quite control. "Then why do you remember me?" And that was the part that did not make sense, the part that unsettled her the most. Because people like him did not remember people like her, not after 2 years, not after a quiet resignation sent by email, not after disappearing without explanation. And yet here he was, speaking as if her absence had mattered, as if it had been noticed, and this time when he responded, there was no hesitation at all, his voice steady, certain. "Because you were not supposed to leave," and the words landed harder than anything else he had said, because they carried implication, expectation, something unspoken but undeniable, and Madeline felt her chest tighten again, her thoughts colliding as she tried to process it, because leaving had not been a choice she made lightly. It had not been something she planned or explained. It had been something she did because she had no other option, because everything in her life had changed too quickly, too suddenly, and there had been no room to stay, no space to explain. And for a moment she looked away, back toward the passing lights outside, her reflection faint in the window, barely recognizable even to herself, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but there was a tension beneath it now, something defensive, something guarded. People leave jobs all the time. And it was true. It was logical, but even as she said it, she knew that was not what he meant, not really, and he seemed to know it too, because his grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, his gaze flicking toward her for the briefest second before returning to the road. And when he spoke again, his tone had shifted, just enough to make her heart beat a little faster. "Not like that," he said, and the weight of those 3 words settled between them, quiet but undeniable, because whatever he remembered, whatever he believed had happened, it was not as simple as she had tried to make it sound, and the past she had buried was no longer distant, no longer quiet. It was here, unfolding in real time, and before she could respond, before she could push back or explain, his voice came again, lower now, more deliberate, as if he was stepping closer to something he had been holding back. "Since the moment he saw her, you left without saying anything," he said. And then, after a brief pause that felt longer than it was, he added, "And now you have a child." And the implication was clearer this time, sharper, impossible to ignore, and Madeline felt the tension rise instantly, her pulse quickening as she turned toward him again, because this was no longer just about recognition or memory. This was about something deeper, something that touched on the part of her life she had kept, hidden from everyone who had known her back then, and her voice came out tighter now, more controlled. "That is none of your business." But even as she said it, she could feel that the line between them had already shifted, that whatever distance she tried to create now was already too late, because he had already seen enough to ask the question that mattered most, the one that hung just beneath everything else, waiting. And as the car slowed slightly, approaching the turn toward her street, his voice came again, quiet but unmistakably focused. "Is the baby yours alone?" And the question settled into the space between them, heavy with meaning, opening a door that could not be easily closed once. Answered. The question did not feel like a question. It felt like a line drawn across something she had spent months trying to protect, and Madeline's breath caught as her fingers tightened in her lap, her nails pressing into her palm just enough to ground her, because for a moment everything inside her reacted at once, the instinct to shut down, to deflect, to say nothing at all, battling against the exhaustion of holding everything together for so long. And she turned her head toward the window again. The familiar streets coming into view now, buildings she recognized, corners she had walked countless times, and that should have made her feel closer to safety, but it did not. Not with his question still hanging in the air, not with the weight of everything he had already said pressing in around her, and she exhaled slowly, her voice quieter when she finally answered, controlled but edged with something that had been building since the moment he spoke her name. "Yes," she said, and then after a brief pause, more firmly, "She is mine." And the words settled between them with a kind of finality, a boundary she was trying to set, a line she was trying to hold. And for a second neither of them spoke, the car turning onto her street, the engine slowing slightly as they passed a row of dimly lit apartment buildings, and she could feel his attention shift, not away, but deeper, more focused, as if her answer had not closed anything, only opened more questions, and that alone made her chest tighten again, because she knew what he was thinking, or at least she thought she did, and she shook her head slightly, almost as if to stop it before it could be said out loud, her voice coming quicker this time, sharper. "There is no one else involved." And the words were deliberate, chosen carefully, not entirely a lie, but not the full truth either, because the full truth was something she had not spoken aloud in a long time, something she had locked away for a reason, and she was not about to unpack it here, not now, not in the middle of everything else. And he did not interrupt her, did not challenge her immediately, but she could feel it, the way the silence shifted again. Heavier now, more deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, but more precise than before. "You are answering the wrong question," he said, and the statement caught her off guard just enough to make her turn back toward him, her brows drawing together slightly, confusion flickering across her face, because she had answered him, she had been clear, and yet he was looking at her like that was not what he had asked at all, like the answer he was waiting for was something else entirely. And her pulse quickened slightly as she tried to understand, tried to follow where he was going with this. And then he continued, his gaze finally shifting from the road to her, sharp, searching, as if he was trying to see through the wall she had built. "I did not ask if you were raising the child alone," he said, each word measured, intentional. "I asked if the baby is yours alone." And the distinction landed harder than she expected, because it changed everything about the question. turned it from something she could deflect into something she could not easily avoid. And for a second, she just stared at him, the meaning settling in, the implication unavoidable now, and her heart began to beat faster, not from fear this time, but from something deeper, something tied to the past he had already started to pull into the present. And she looked away again quickly, her thoughts racing, searching for something to say, something to shut this down before it went further. Because this was not a conversation she was ready to have. Not here, not like this, not with someone who already seemed to know too much. And the car slowed to a stop in front of her building, the engine idling quietly as the reality of where they were finally settled in, and she reached for the door handle almost immediately, her focus snapping back to what mattered most, her daughter, the urgency that had started all of this rushing back to the surface. And she pulled the door open without hesitation, stepping out into the cool evening air before he could say anything else, because she needed to move, needed to get upstairs, needed to see her child. And yet, even as she turned toward the building, she could feel it, the unfinished tension between them, the question still lingering, unanswered. And as she hurried toward the entrance, her steps quick, almost rushed, his voice came again from behind her, not loud, but clear enough to stop her for just a fraction of a second. Madeline. And she froze just long enough to hear the rest, her breath catching as the words reached her, quieter now, but carrying a weight that made it impossible to ignore. How old is your daughter exactly? And this time the question felt different, sharper, more precise, as if the answer mattered in a way she could not yet fully understand. And for the first time since this began, hesitation replaced urgency, just for a moment, as the realization settled in that whatever she said next could change everything. Madeline's hand remained on the door handle, her fingers curled tightly around it as his question settled into the space between them, heavier than anything he had asked before. And for a moment she did not move, did not turn, because something about the way he said it made it impossible to dismiss, impossible to brush aside as just another intrusive question. And her breath slowed slightly, uneven now, as her mind tried to catch up, tried to understand why that detail, that specific detail, mattered so much to him. And she knew the answer before she allowed herself to admit it, felt it in the way her chest tightened, in the way her thoughts suddenly shifted back, not just to the past 2 years, but further, to a moment she had buried so deeply she rarely let herself revisit it. And she closed her eyes briefly, her grip on the door tightening just a fraction before she finally turned back toward him, slowly, deliberately, because avoiding this was no longer an option, not if she wanted to move forward, not if she wanted to keep control of what little she still held on to. And when she faced him again, her expression was different now, more guarded, more aware, as if she understood the weight of what she was about to say. And her voice, when it came, was steady but quiet. She is 8 months old. And the words seemed to linger in the air longer than they should have, as if time itself had slowed just enough to let them settle fully. And she watched him closely this time, watched the way his expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else might notice, but enough, just enough for her to see it, the slight tightening of his jaw, the flicker of calculation behind his eyes, the way his grip on the steering wheel shifted almost imperceptibly. And she knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest, that he was doing the math, that he had already started connecting something she had tried so hard to keep separate. And that realization sent a ripple of unease through her, because she knew exactly what that calculation would lead to if he followed it all the way through. And she did not give him the chance to speak. Not yet, her voice coming again, firmer this time, cutting through the silence before he could fill it. That is all you need to know. And the statement was clear, intentional, a boundary she was trying to draw, even if it came too late. And for a second neither of them moved, the quiet hum of the engine filling the space as the tension between them settled into something sharper, something more defined. And then she turned away again, this time without hesitation, pushing the door open fully and stepping out into the evening air, the cool breeze hitting her face as she pulled her coat tighter around herself, grounding her just enough to keep moving. Because she could not stay here, not any longer, not with everything that was beginning to surface. And she shut the door behind her with a soft but final sound, already turning toward the entrance of her building, her steps quick, purposeful, driven by the urgency that had never really left, only been pushed aside for a moment. And as she reached the door, fumbling slightly with her keys, her mind raced again. But this time it was not just fear for her daughter. It was the realization that the past she had tried to escape was no longer behind her. Was here, catching up, asking questions she could not easily answer. And as she pushed the door open and stepped inside, the dim hallway stretching out in front of her, she did not look back, did not allow herself to, even though she could feel it, could feel his presence still there, still watching, still waiting, and for a brief second, just before the door closed behind her, his voice carried through the narrow space, quieter now but unmistakably certain. 8 months, he repeated, almost to himself, and then, just as the door clicked shut, cutting off the rest of the world, the final words followed, low but clear enough to send a chill through her chest as she hurried toward the stairs. That means you left right after that night. And the implication landed fully this time. No longer a question, no longer uncertain, but something else entirely, something that changed everything about what came next.